we're going to call the meeting to order. This is the county commissioners finance meeting. We do this every week that warrants it. Today, June 16. It's just a little past the appointed hour, 1:30. And we have minutes from our May 26th meeting that we could get a motion to take action on those.
I will move to approve the minutes of May 26th, 2021.
Second.
It's moved and seconded. All in favor, indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. Okay. Item 3 is our topic for discussion today, geo-enabled election, and raring to go, apparently, is Justin Smith.
Yeah.
So, Justin, we'll turn it over to you.
Okay, well, a little backstory. So last year, before the whole pandemic started, I actually gave this presentation here. So there was a lot of confusion. I've given this presentation with Mark a couple of times. We didn't realize that this wasn't canceled. So here I am again. So I learned, after learning that in the last 2 hours, I threw some stuff in here to make it sort of more of a live demonstration of what we're working on. So there's some things moved around a bit. Your pamphlets might not be completely accurate. And yeah, so I am ready to go. All right, so we're going to talk about how GIS is used in elections to increase accuracy. We'll talk about precinct polygons and how they are used as really the smallest unit of area in elections, as sort of like the building block for all other units of area in elections. Registered voters and how they synchronize in GIS, the list of registered voters and the GIS database of addresses and how we can combine those to make make both data sets actually more accurate. Redistricting, we're going to talk about redistricting at the precinct level, and we'll briefly talk about the larger levels of congressional districts and things like that, but only really as it pertains to precincts being moved around in redistricting. Potential polling places need to change through no fault of elections, circumstances that locations change and polling places therefore need to change, and how do we know where to place new polling places? And then we'll look at the voter locator web map application, which is really giving GIS, putting GIS in the hands of election officials. Okay, so we start out with our precinct polygons, and voting precincts are subdivisions of local jurisdictions, in this case municipalities. So here we're just going to flip in between. So here we have a map of municipalities, 33 municipalities in the county. And when I flip this over, you're going to see precincts, and you'll see that all the precincts fall within municipal boundaries. Okay. Okay, so when we developed the precinct boundary layer, we started with the municipality layer and then cut up the precincts from there, because we didn't have a precinct layer until maybe 2008.
Now, that's not required by law, right? That it be a subdivision of a municipality. Will they ever cross those boundaries? Is that ever, we don't want to do that.
I wouldn't think we want to do that. I don't know. I wouldn't know exactly where it would be in the election code or statutes. I wouldn't know where it is, but I would assume that it's in there. And I might actually have that coming up in some statutes.
That certainly inhibits our flexibility in redrawing those lines, but that's fine. Go ahead.
Okay, so precincts start with court-ordered elections. Court orders. So these court orders are the authoritative source for defining the precinct. So here we have, South Middleton was recently split. In 2010, we worked on redistricting South Middleton's precincts from 4 precincts to 10 precincts. And I wanted to use, I really cherry picked a bad precinct description to just show you what could be out there. So this, we don't have, Cumberland County no longer has any precinct descriptions that are this bad. We have pretty good precinct descriptions after we got rid of South Milton's precinct descriptions. So here we start, I was highlight this one. It says, the northern boundary of this precinct is formed by a private road. Okay, it's off to a good descriptive start there. And then down here at the bottom, the eastern border is formed approximately 1,600 feet north of Sheet Iron Road, and then that line runs north to south between that point and the county line. So here we're talking about a boundary that is approximately 1,600 feet north of a road, and then that runs north to south. So not a great description for trying to draw a line on a map. But here we're using, here right up the top, I'm not going to read the description, but here right up the top, we're following roads, railroads, streams, and existing municipality boundaries. Those are the only four items that we're following: roads, railroads, streams, physical boundaries, and then existing municipality boundaries is our fourth boundary type. And these were developed. So we went through some drafts in cooperation with the Board of Elections and the municipalities who were requesting that they be redistricted for precincts. I wrote these descriptions. They were reviewed by the solicitor, and then they were approved by the board. So here are some precinct polygons. Here you can see that we have a railroad forming a boundary, municipality boundary forming a boundary. Here's a road forming a boundary, and then we also, the other type boundary type would be a street. So all precinct boundaries, all municipality boundaries are precinct boundaries. And then we try to follow authoritative vector layers. So those would be line layers, polygon layers. We try to follow those authoritative layers. And then we want these precinct attributes. So we've developed, so here you see 2602. That is, 26 is the shore systems code for South Middleton. 02 is precinct 02. So we're using the same type of attributes in our database, in our polygons, so they can match the elections database schema. So our precincts, we try to develop our precincts to be official, so they can be used for official maps, and functional, so they can be used for mapping work. So our precincts are going to do some work for us, and we'll show you an example of that in a bit. So here, whenever you see this type of parchment, it might be difficult to see from certain angles, but I'm using kind of a parchment background here, and whenever you see that, I'm pulling all of these, all the text here is pulled directly from a statute or a code or something like that for the state. So we have the statewide uniform registry of electors, which is the shore system, which is what our Bureau of Elections officials and staff, they go into, and they work in the shore system every day, registering new voters. They use it to send out voter registration cards. That's the place where we maintain our listing of registered voters. And they're working on a new shore system, a shore modernization, which we'll also talk about later in the presentation, some new content. So every county election department accesses the shore system, and this statute mandates that the counties do that. So this is a look at the current shore system. Currently, the shore system is not GIS enabled. They're looking to make the new shore system GIS enabled. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But right now, the shore system it acts a lot like the Master Street and Address Guide. So we'll get into that. So this is here we have, I'll just go through the fields here. So here it says OEB, that's odd, even, or both. So odd side of the street, both sides of the street, even side of the street. And here we have some ranges where, a registered voter would fall into some of these ranges. And then here's the street name, and then here's your precinct code again. 19 and 13, I believe that's the difference between Middlesex and maybe Silver Spring precincts as well as here. So we have 1901, 1302, precincts 1, precincts 2, and those are respective municipalities. Then, if you note that here we have a range of 870 in the shore system, starting at 870 on Harrisburg Pike. And then here's our master street address guide. Here's another range starting at 870. That's not, so this is master street address guide. This is our 911 database of street addresses and ranges. 911 is also going through a transition to a fully GIS system as well. It's called Next Gen 911. So we have our shore modernization project moving from a tabular database to a GIS system. We have our 911 database moving from a tabular database to a GIS system. So there's going to be some synergies there that we can take advantage of, and which shore modernization is taking advantage of. So these ranges being identical here between the MSAG and the shore system, that's not organic, that's intentional. We make sure we went through a synchronization, a tabular synchronization with these probably a decade ago to make sure that the election database in shore matched the 911 database for the MSAG, and these address ranges were correct and matched. So again, these current systems, these are tabular systems, and not a bad thing. It's actually, as tabular systems go, it's very efficient because you can have, these are valid address ranges, right? So we call them a valid address range of 870 to 1048, Harrisburg Pike, North Middleton. So if somebody moves in, if somebody builds a house on Harrisburg Pike in North Middleton, it can fall at 1,000, it can fall at 900. It's going to be a valid address. We don't have to interact with that at all, right? They just build the house, it falls within a valid address range. They're automatically going to be in the system. That address range is going to be in the system for them to register at, in North Middleton Precinct 1 or something like that. It's already in the system. So it is an actually efficient way to manage address ranges. And so that we don't have to constantly be touching the database to make sure that new addresses are valid. So this is how it intersects, this is how it begins to intersect with GIS. So here we have Harrisburg Pike, and we have a range here for the segment. So 1160 to 1200. We have a left side and right side, so we have an even side and an odd side of the street. The right side, I believe the addresses are going this way. So the right side of the street would be odd in Middlesex. The left side of the street would be even in Middlesex 1. And we try and draw all of these data sets together, right? The precincts are drawn with municipality boundaries. The precincts are also drawn with the road center lines, and these all have to be drawn together so that they can be functional, so that this line segment for the road matches the geometry of the parcel polygon. And when they match, then they can do some GIS work. So we can start locating voters inside of these areas. So what do? We take the shore records, and this is kind of what a shore export looks like. We've changed everybody to John Doe, tried to get rid of all that personal information in this example. But it still works because we have, and usually when we geocode, when we actually do this geocoding of placing these voters at our address points or on our map, we usually don't even care about their name. We don't care about their name. We don't care about R's and D's. We just care about this ID number. So if there's a discrepancy between the polygon that they're put in, so if we put them in Monroe 1, we want this precinct code to match Monroe 1. And if it doesn't match, then there's a problem. Then we can go back and say, okay, there's a problem with this ID number. We need to take a look at that. So this is really how we synchronize GIS with the voting records. So what we can do, and this is how we do that selection. This is an example of where we still have problems. We have a election database of 160,000 registered voters in the county. So what we do is when we place all the registered voters on these address points, then what we do is we select where the Shores precinct, the Shores district, does not equal the GIS precinct. And where we find almost all of our problems, probably maybe 300 to 500 problems. And then we know about them. They're not really problems of where people vote. It's mainly the problem of how the GIS data and the election data is built. And we'll get into exactly why that is a little bit later. But we find that most of the problems are along municipality boundaries. And here we have a municipality boundary right here. We're not having problems. We're selecting where the errors are right here. We're selecting where the Shore district is not equal to GIS district. And those errors are along the municipality boundary. You don't see anything else selected anywhere else. So we'll get into specifically why that is a little bit later. Okay, so here's a new slide. And we'll talk about we'll talk about the new shore modernization project. So in December, the State Department signed a contract with BPro to do their shore modernization. I believe it's like a $11 million contract over 2 to 4 years through some phases, different phases of the project. And the Department of State sent out a survey to county GIS end of April this year. And they specifically, in this survey, they specifically requested map service URLs of geo-enabled voting district boundaries and geo-enabled address points. And we'll get into a little bit about what exactly a map service URL is. But that's the information they wanted from GIS. And they're going to have, it's June 16th today, June 17th, tomorrow. Tomorrow, the Department of State is hosting a GIS webinar. So this is really going to be the first real interaction that we've had with the state, Department of State and GIS and their shore modernization project. We'll have a webinar tomorrow with them about that. And that's really going to be the first that we hear about it. First we hear the details. All this is just kind of pulling from their contract and surveys that they put out. So I'm going to go right now to our open data site. And this open data site is where we have data published online for people to consume. This might not be inside. And this is where we directed this survey. We have our geo-enabled, we have voting district boundaries published as map service URLs and address points published. So this. Okay. Excuse me. This is the county's open data site. We use this to serve out information. It's much easier to use. We don't have to interact with the public. If somebody calls in and they ask for data, we just say, go here, download the data. And so we can go here to elections, look at voting precincts, and here's our voting precincts for the county that you can just download. And There's Patrick published it, it's right there. So, so what you can do is you can just come up here and the download buttons in there, Patrick.
You have to click on it first. Yeah, within the past few months, they've changed the user interface to this open data platform.
So there's a download button. If I want to download it as different types of files, download right there. And so we put this out there because we'll talk. So we put this out there a year or two ago. Well, in the summer of 2020, because we get a lot of requests for this data, usually from national committees, usually about a month before an election. So that's when we get requests for voting precinct data, our polygons. So we put it out there online, and this last, for the fall 2020 election, we got a bunch of requests, and we just directed them to this website, and they could download the data if they wanted. And so this is real. This is we've already. So we had this data published. I'll go back to my presentation. So again, the Department of State in April requested this as map service URLs. Well, we were just able to point them to our open data site, and we had that information. I'm trying to get the state to share the results of their survey. My guess would be maybe 20% of the counties were probably able to provide map service URLs. I think the Department of State gave us like 4 days to complete the survey. So I think maybe 20% of counties might have been able to, from what I could tell from talking to other counties, provide that information in that format to the Department of State. So the address points data. Again, so not only were we able to provide the address or the voting precincts, but we were able to provide the address points data. And I might have to zoom way in here for them to show. It's just too big of a data set to show as far as zoomed out. So it might take a second or two to load. Hopefully, I think it loads there. There they are. So clicking on that there, we can see we're looking at 19 East Portland Street. So that's our address points database. We have about 114,000 address points. And our address points are maintained in the national 911, next to 911 standard. And we've established some pretty complex workflows to serve GIS addresses into 911, our 911 computer aided dispatch system. It goes from municipalities creating addresses to coordinating them with the GIS department to get those addresses. We work with building permits from assessment. We take that data. We look at parcel data. We create address points. We take those address points and we go through a monthly load into the 911 system. But it has to be acknowledged that the Department of State is asking for these GIS address points. These address points have been designed to work for 911. They're going to have to do geo-enabled work, but they're designed for 911 work. And there's that one specific example of how address points behave along municipality boundaries that we'll get into at the end of the presentation, where it kind of causes problems. You're not aware of that situation, but I'm sure there's other kinds of, when we're talking about boundaries and points and hundreds of thousands of registered voters and across the state, there's going to be lots of different problems that we're going to run into. The Department of State is going to have to address at some point. Okay, so redistricting. We're just going to talk about voting district redistricting, which I'm calling them precincts, but they're also referred to as voting districts. I think that can get a little bit confusing, but I'll just call them precincts. So in the election code, the court of common pleas can create new precincts. It advises you to divide boroughs or townships into compact and contiguous precincts. Boundaries should be formed by clearly visible physical features that conform to census block lines. And we'll talk about census block lines in a bit, where we use census block lines as a building block to create new precinct drafts. And new precincts should contain no more than 1,200 registered voters. Those are the specific guidelines that we follow in the election code when we're redistricting precincts. And we haven't redistricted a precinct in a while. I think the last one was maybe 20, South, how was it South? We did Upper Allen, Silver Spring. Silver Spring might have been the last one, like maybe 2012 or something like that. So it was at least 10 years since we've done this. So we're going to start with our precinct redistricting with municipality polygon. That's going to be any potential precinct lines are going to have to follow the municipality polygon of Silver Spring to begin with. Then we're going to add our geocode. We're going to add our registered voters as points. Then we're going to add our census block lines. As census block lines, as they were defined in the code, all boundaries must follow census block lines in addition to other physical boundaries. So now we have our municipal polygons, our geocoded, geolocated, geo-enabled address points for our voters, and we have our census block lines. And now we're going to spatially, this is where the GIS work comes in. We spatially join a count of the registered voters to the census blocks. So each one of these census blocks, this is a census block right here, we're going to count how many registered voters are in each one of these census blocks. So there we go. Now we have a count of each registered voter in the census block. And we're going to go back a slide just to see what we're trying to do with this. We're following the guidelines of the election code. So we're looking at where we're dividing our township. We are forming them from census block lines, and we're counting the registered voters so that we stay underneath that 1,200. So municipality boundary, registered voters, census block lines, and then a count of how many registered voters are in those census blocks. And this is kind of a workflow of how we got to this point. So we're using census blocks. So all the blue here is GIS data. So census blocks, GIS data set, roads, streams, municipality boundaries. We're taking our GIS inputs. We're using our roads, address points to geocode voters. Then we joined the census blocks and the voters to count how many registered voters are in each census block. Then we're sort of doing a kind of an organic merging process where we form these census blocks in different configurations to give potential drafts of precincts, and we'll show you that. So we want to draft a couple different proposals. We don't want to just say, okay, GIS did their magic, here's your new precincts. We want to give a bunch of options. Because Silver Spring officials are going to have a better idea of what they want to see with their precincts than I would know for Silver Spring. So we work with the election department and we solicit that feedback from the municipality officials, and we assemble So I can flip through here and you can see some different configurations. Here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Here we only have 6 precincts in Silver Spring, but 3 of them are over 1,200 registered voters in our proposal. So here we have, I think this might be the 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, this is the 9 one. I think this is the one we ended up with. The 9 precinct draft that's currently the Silver Spring precinct districts. And I think that's the one we went with. Okay. So if you remember, they talked, the election code also talked about compactness and being contiguous. So there's a measurement that I like to use for compactness. It's called the Polls-Popper measurement. Here we have this equation. It's 4 times pi times area divided by the perimeter squared. We're going to just ignore that math. We're not going to be doing math, but what we can see in a simple demonstration is that the perfect shape for compactness is a circle. A circle is perfectly compact. Okay, so it scores a 100%. A square will score like a 79%. This kind of rectangle shape will score a 60%. This shape scores a 25%, and this shape scores a 7% compactness. So we want to try and get a compactness score as close to 1 as possible. 1 is basically impossible to get because you can't really draw circles everywhere because then you leave these gaps everywhere. So really, I would say if you're over 25% to 25 to 60% is probably a good compactness score that's reasonable. Because we're trying to follow physical boundaries. We're trying to make the boundaries make sense. So really, if you look at most districts, even really well-drawn districts, even really compact districts, they really only score in that like 30, 40, 50% range compactness. And there's many different ways to measure compactness and shapes and gerrymandering. But this is the one I like to use because it's a rather simple formula. You can understand what you're trying to achieve in that circle for compactness. So these are these are the compactness scores, those Polls-Popper compactness scores for those 9 South Silver Spring precincts that we just looked at. And here we can see, our lowest score is 25%. Our highest score is 72%. And we're pretty much averaging around 50%. I think that's the average, is 52%. So in general, the more compact a shape is, the less likely it is to have been gerrymandered, and which doesn't really affect. I don't think many people accuse precincts of being gerrymandered because there's no real elections being held at the precinct level. There's no real, precincts are really just a building block for other voting districts. But we try and follow physical features that make logical, recognizable boundaries, right? We want the Carlisle Pike to be a boundary. We want the Conn McGuinnett to be a boundary because those are easily identifiable. We want Route 81. Those are easily identifiable boundaries that make clear boundaries, but sometimes following those physical features can lead to some weird shapes. And I'll just mention so there is a redistricting website that the state hosts, and this is where basically after every redistricting, this is where you go to find the GIS data for the new state Senate, House, and U.S. Congress districts, and it's a good source for us to use. Okay, so about legislative redistricting. So the PA Reapportionment Commission is in charge of redrawing legislative districts after the census. So They should be getting started fairly soon, if they're not already started. And then the Supreme Court reviews them. But we're not so concerned about, that's not our job. This is our job. What does the county need to do? Once they're done their job, then the county can start their job. So we need to reassign voters into their new legislative districts, right? Because we want to make sure that each voter gets the proper ballot. We want to make sure that, if you're voting in if you're supposed to be in the new congressional district 13, then we need to move you out of whatever congressional district you were before and put you in that new congressional district 13 after this portion is all approved and completed and ink is signed, dried. Then we need to jump in there and jump into the short system and we need to assign precincts to legislative districts. And it gets tricky. Sometimes these precincts are split by legislative districts. And when a precinct gets split by a legislative district, we talked about the precincts being the smallest common denominator. Well, sometimes that smallest common denominator is split by a legislative district, and then it gets tricky. And we'll show an example of that. Okay, so this is, these are our Pennsylvania House districts, Pennsylvania Senate districts, and then this is our congressional House districts. And this is where I talked about getting messy, where North Middleton Precinct 3 and North Middleton Precinct 1 are both split. They're splitting precincts with their congressional districts. So what we had to do was we had to create a North Middleton 3 Congressional District 13 and a North Middleton Precinct 3 Congressional District 10. So now we have two precincts. We have two polygons for one precinct so that we can manage this congressional split of the precinct. Again, here, there's like 7 people that live in North Middleton 1 precinct, but Congressional District 13. And all the rest live in North Middleton 1, Congressional District 10. And it gets confusing because whenever you're reading the definitions, the authoritative source definitions for these congressional districts, they actually cite census block, Cumberland County Census Block 7,422, including Cumberland County Census Block 7,397. And you have to go through and figure out what all those census blocks are and where they need to go, then figure out what registered voters need to be split out between the congressional districts. And they do this because, I don't know why they do it, but they seem to prefer to have these congressional districts be exactly similar. So if you look at the congressional districts in Pennsylvania, each congressional district in Pennsylvania has there's maybe a difference of one person, but they're all 705,688 or 689 persons, all very precisely even when it comes to the count. So in order to do that, I suppose that's why they go and cut precincts up. And then there's Governor Wolf had a commission set up to look at redistricting reform. And I'm not going to really talk about that, but it's an interesting read if you know about redistricting. Okay. So when you look at, we'll skip the polling places now. So polling places are to be public buildings where possible. And they prefer, schoolhouses, municipal buildings. And if there's no available public building, then in that election district, then the county board of electors can designate a public building in another election district that's immediately adjacent to that boundary. So those are our guidelines and statutes for following polling places. So we maintain a list of potential polling places. Here's a list of all potential polling places in Mechanicsburg. And here we can see, this is a precinct, and in that precinct, there's a good number of potential polling places should the need arise to change polling places. And then we can give this list to election staff, and the election staff has to go out there and scout those locations to make sure they're ADA compliant. And I'm sure you've had those conversations with election staff going over exactly what the criteria is for their polling place selection. But we just try and give them that initial list of to scout. And to sort of go out there and solicit for, because they can ask any place, and that place can say no, and they go try the next place. Okay. So here's our web application. We try to give the GIS, put the GIS in the hands of the election staff. So just, we're just trying to place addresses into precincts. That's all we're trying to do. And it's good because the staff can just check for an address, and that registered voter should match in the shore system. So I'm going to give a demo here. Here's our voter locator application that we have our election staff use. And here we have Hampton 11, East Pennsboro 2. I'm going to type in an address. Okay. I typed in 1993 Hummel Avenue. Here's the parcel for that Hummel Avenue address. We can see we're in Lower Island 3. So the election staff uses this weekly to confirm addresses in precincts. It's especially useful if there's a new subdivision. So previously, before there was a GIS component to this, the election staff had to call up Lower Island Township and say, somebody's trying to register to vote in Lower Island Township. I think it's Lower Island Township. They say they are in Camp Hill zip code or something like that. They'll give them a zip code and they got to figure out, okay, what township should I contact? And then the township would have to guess pretty much, unless they had a good idea of where the precincts were, because there weren't very good maps of where that new subdivision fell into which precinct. And whereas at the time, GIS and 911 were going down a similar path where we were interested in address information and where new addresses were being put in and what municipality they were being put into. And so it's kind of a simple thing before anybody called them geo-enabled elections to just kind of merge those data sets and use both. So now I'm going to go ahead and show you where the tricky spots are with boundaries. So here we have the boundary between Hampton and East Pennsboro. And the boundary between Hampton and East Pennsboro, we align this data set, these municipal boundaries, with PennDOT's municipal boundaries. PennDOT municipal boundaries have been used for many years for liquid fuels reimbursement for municipalities. So PennDOT has had an interest for many years to have good mapping for municipality boundaries. The State Geo Board was put into place 2015, and they very quickly identified PennDOT as having being the authoritative source for municipal boundaries in Pennsylvania. So we have aligned all of our municipality boundaries with PennDOT. We've aligned all of our voting precinct boundaries where they are along municipality boundaries. So here's a boundary between Silver Spring and Hampton. We've aligned all of our boundaries with PennDOT's precinct boundaries as well. So that causes some issues I'm gonna go ahead and zoom in here. I'm not picking on Hampton and East Pennsboro. I could do this for almost any county or any township boundary, because you have to remember, township boundaries were created, especially Hampton East Pennsboro boundary. This boundary is probably from 1830. So they're dealing with, and you can look at the Hampton Township East Pennsboro road docket that defines the boundary in the clerk of courts. And it talks about a point up on the mountain, like a tree up on the mountain, going down to a tavern that doesn't exist anymore. It was, removed 100 years ago. So these boundaries are tough. And it's been, the state knows these boundaries are tough, and it's just going to be, the problem is only growing because of the accuracy of mapping nowadays. So the accuracy of mapping today is amplifying the inaccuracies of mapping from 200 years ago. And so I'm not picking on Hampton East Pennsboro. I could go to almost any, borough boundaries are a little bit better because borough boundaries were established via annexation up until the 1970s, when annexation was no longer allowed by boroughs. So those surveys are much, they're 20th century surveys, they're better, there's better boundaries for boroughs, but between township and township, it's tough. So here I'm looking at, this is Kent Drive. I'm not sure if you can see that. I'm sorry. I'll have to zoom. I'll use another mapping application in a second if you can't see it very well. But I'm going to add our tax parcels. And I'm going to select, remember this pink, the pink that we're looking at is East Pennsboro 2. And the orange we're looking at is Hampton 11. So I'm going to select this house that's in the pink, that's in East Pennsboro 2. And it is being taxed in Hampton Township. So this is a difficulty with just assuming that address points and voting precincts align and can be used for geo-enabled elections. So, I'm going to communicate these concerns to the State Department. This is not how the information is in our shore system. I can tell you that, this 1107 Kent Drive is voting in Hampton because they're being taxed in Hampton. That's how we have it set up. Where you're being taxed is where you're voting. And that's just the way that we're handling these delicate boundary issues. It's just sort of how it's how we've handled boundary issues with 911 for the last 20 years, and it's how we've started to handle these issues with elections in the last 8 to 10 years.
So on that, where's the tipping point where, because some of those, as you can see, are bisected increasingly towards the center.
So that's a Hampton parcel, that's a Hampton parcel, that's an East Pennsboro parcel.
Heading southerly down.
Yeah, so these are going to be Hampton, these are all going to be Hampton because they're all over here. These are all Hampton.
Okay, yeah.
Hampton. So how that looks in GIS. So this is orange, this is Hampton 11. This is the pink, this is East Pennsboro 2. This is my GIS software, this is the software I use to edit. So I can kind of symbolize things and label things however I want. But so this is that PennDOT boundary that we are using for the official voting precinct layer. This black line here is what we're using in 911. This is reflective of the taxation boundaries. And this is what we use for a functional precinct boundary. So we have our official precinct boundary, we have a functional precinct boundary.
What about, it probably doesn't affect your function here, but Hampton and East Penn area is also one of those that a lot of confusion among the public is created by the fact that we've got zip code boundaries.
Boundaries are completely different.
Yeah. So do we have an overlay on that? Because
I have zip code boundaries.
I know you don't have to pull it up.
I don't really want to pull it up because if you talk to the post office and you really start digging with the post office, Zip codes are not polygons. They're routes. They're service delivery routes. Zip codes are never meant to be displayed as a polygon. So that makes it tricky when you're trying to draw.
I'll take your word for it.
Yeah, it's messy because zip codes are service delivery routes. They are not polygons.
We do get some inquiries from time to time from voters in those areas, particularly in East Penn. It's like, well, I have a Camp Hill address, and throw that in,
Right.
Which
Right.
really does not affect our.
And one thing that makes it especially tricky is when somebody tries to pull a PO box zip code.
Oh yeah.
Because PO box, like if a zip code has no polygon, then a PO box definitely has no established boundary, right? And we don't mail voter registration cards to PO boxes. We mail voter registration cards to addresses. A voter registration card, you can't register to vote at a PO box. You have to register to vote at an address. So if somebody tries to register to vote in New Kingston or Summerdale or Grantham, those are post-office boxes. We have to give them a zip code, not a PO box zip code. Like if we give them a delivery route, it's complicated.
Yeah.
So
That's a good illustration, though, that this is not nearly as simple as a lot of the public believes it is. There's so many layers of.
Yeah, and it's yeah. I mean, I understand like you're an exception, but we're dealing with 160,000 registered voters here. We have to have a consistent approach to locating and processing those addresses. So that's just an example of where these boundaries, you're talking about municipality boundaries and how they can give us problems, and zip codes can also give us problems in the same sort of way, where along the boundaries it gets fuzzy for different reasons. And we're trying to be extremely precise. We want these address points to fall within. We want these address points to fall properly within these precincts. That's how you get to this geo-enabled election, that geo-enabled election layers that the Department of State is requesting from us. They have to work in concert with one another, and when they don't, first of all, it can be hard to find those errors to begin with. If you're not aware of where those problem areas can be, then you might miss those problem areas completely. So, NISJIC is a GIS national organization that has geo-enabled election best practices. I'm going to skip over this next slide. It's a little old and outdated. I'm not sure exactly the status of this Pennsylvania pilot. It's been over a year. I'm not sure if that's really gone anywhere, so I'm just going to skip over that. We talk about, we'll kind of summarize the sort of geo-enabled elections cooperation between the elections, the Bureau of Elections and Cumberland County GIS that's happened so far. And this has really been developed by these two departments working together, and not really from any this NISJIC, these recommendations of best practices, I think they came out in like 2019, something like that. But whereas we've been working with elections for a decade now, and this is sort of what we've come up with. So with Precinct Polygons, we have sort of a life cycle for developing precinct polygons when new polygons are requested, or when new precincts are requested from election board. We go from drafting to enactment to publishing, and we really try to follow the letter of the law to ensure that we have all of the variables accounted for. Redistricting analysis, whenever there's a redistricting every 10 years, we need to make sure that we're assigning new voters, we're assigning precincts and we're assigning new voters to the proper new districts. So they get the right ballot to vote in the congressional, state, Senate elections. We have maintain a list of eligible buildings for potential polling places. We're working right now on our annual check of election records. So we basically synchronize the whole 160,000 registered voters with our GIS records to make sure that our data is still accurate. And as we do this, there's less and less errors as we go, right? The first time we did this in 2008 or 2006 or whenever the first time we did this, we sort of opened up some surprises and a lot of fixing and coordination and data set alignment. But since then, the synchronization scores higher and higher every time. And we looked at our voter locator web application that allows the election staff to continuously check GIS at their convenience. So when we get to geo-enabled elections, we're really talking about taking, I made this a while ago, but this pertains to what the Department of State is asking for. The Department of State is asking for address points. The Department of State is asking for precinct polygons. Those are the two data sets they asked us for. So how do we get there? We create these precinct polygons from our roads, municipality boundaries, streams, railroads, those physical features that we follow to cut up those municipality boundaries to create the precinct polygons following the election code. And then we have our address points. Our address points are really, these are 911 address points. They're from the 911 system. They're for 911. That's their job. We are a good secondary address points, of course, have great secondary uses, tertiary uses. They're going to be good for a lot of different uses, but here we're using them for geo-enabled elections, geocoding the addresses, creating those voter points we looked at, and then making sure those voter points are falling in the right precincts. Geo-enabled elections is the outcome there. So that's our basic workflow of geo-enabled elections. And the shore system is going to be, we're going to have a GIS component in the shore system. So I think that's, have that in here? Let's see. Oh, yeah, I already talked about the shore system. Okay. Yes, we already talked about the shore system. Okay. So I think these are the same ones that I talked about last year, but most counties have a capable GIS department. It's a good start. The short, I did change this note, the short system is requesting county address points and voting precincts. We have to remember that these are all developed for 911, and they can be, and really the power of GIS is that we're developing them in conjunction with 911. They're all developed with each other. So they can all do many types of work. And we talked about the challenges being the jurisdiction boundaries, creating trickle-down problems. The authoritative data. So those precinct descriptions, those court-ordered precinct descriptions, those are non-spatial. Those are in a non-spatial format. It's just a paragraph description of a precinct boundary. So how do there was a lot of work creating that polygon layer to begin with, and other counties are going to have to get there if they're not there yet. I think most of them are though. And this is the big one, this last one. So now that the Department of State is requesting GIS information from the counties, there's still no official recommendation for how this GIS data is to be maintained for the Department of State. PEMA has been working on Next Gen 911 for years now. PEMA has published best practices and standards. They've had outreach. They've done a gap analysis. Gap analysis was extremely important. So the gap analysis is basically, we know, we have county GIS data that's being used in 911 CAD systems. We know these Next Gen 911 standards. What's the gap between the two? How far do we need to remediate this data from its current use in county 911 computer dispatch to where we need it to be in Next Gen 911 geospatial call routing? And how far do we need to go to get it to that point of readiness? It's probably an important step in this Department of State project is doing some sort of gap analysis. And what is the quality? What is the quality of the GIS data that the counties have right now? What are the standards that the new shore modernization system is bringing? And how much remediation needs to happen? How much data fixing and workflow adjustments need to happen with that GIS? With GIS to get them to where they need to be for that geo-enabled collections and shore modernization. That's my presentation.
One or two questions. On that last page, you mentioned about the challenges, jurisdiction boundary issues, trickle down to the precinct legislative issues. We went through quite an ordeal with that South Middleton Dickinson Township boundary a number of years back.
I was there.
Yeah, and it took years to manifest itself fully, then we had to swap a bunch of. I shouldn't even ask this in an open meeting, but do we have any other ticking time bombs out there in terms of? Next question, please.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to get into that, I can get into that. I would say potentially, yes. There is best way I could do right now is kick that down the road, say that the Pennsylvania Geospatial Board has a subcommittee that is looking at legislative or jurisdictional boundaries. And they've come out with some suggestions of developing an authoritative data set for the state, whereby, so one of the issues we're looking at is, where taxation doesn't meet with precinct boundaries, or I'm sorry, with municipal boundaries. And they're looking for some sort of functional, authoritative municipal boundary layer that can be used to place taxation inside. They think that is 20 to 30 to 40 years away. Even if they started working on it really hard right now. It is a very complex issue. I mean, you're talking about surveyors, and surveyors are a lot more expensive than GIS. GIS is, once you get down, there's a common saying that once you get down to looking at a site, once you get down to sub-parcel site mapping, GIS stands for get it surveyed. So GIS is really good at large scale analysis and putting together a large picture of a county and making sure all that can fit together. But when you're talking about going back to an 1830 survey of, a court-ordered 1830 survey, and you're trying to place trees and fence lines and things that were gone 100 years ago. The South Middleton Dickinson boundary had 5 monumented points from the 1859 boundary line that established it. And they found one of them. when they were doing the resurvey or the re-engineering of that boundary line. And I was at those hearings. People were coming into those hearings, and they're asking for testimony at those hearings. Folks were coming in talking about their, what happens. I don't want my kid to change school districts. And the commissioners of the Boundary Commission were saying that's not relevant. Do you have any testimony on the 1859 boundary line? I mean, what are you supposed to do? I mean, nobody should want that situation to happen again. But these boundary lines are very old and out of date, and something should be done with the way modern mapping is going. And I hope that the Geo Board can affect some change, and I hope that state legislature listens, because this is a state issue. The county's role in municipal boundaries, and the county's only role that I can tell, is to archive. So, the state courts, we have, stuff goes in front of the courts here, but they're really the state's courts. And they get recorded into road dockets, and Barb does a great job over in the archives of making that they're available now on websites. It might take me a little while to go to if you want to take a look, but they're available on the archiving websites, and those documents from 200 years ago. So the county does a good job of archiving that, but as far as defining where those boundaries are, it's not the county's responsibility.
I don't disagree with that at all. So here's, I guess, a half statement, half question. So we continue to be a very rapidly growing county. So it would seem on first blush that it would make a lot of sense to correct those boundaries prior to an area coming under new development and opening the door for a lot of challenges down the road.
Yeah.
It may not be practical.
I don't, when it comes to new development, I don't encounter those boundary problems so much with new development. New development has a pretty good idea of where the boundary lines, even if they're written 200 years ago. And even if they don't have a good idea where those boundary lines are, they have a good idea of where it's fuzzy and how to design their subdivision so that it stays on the other sides of where it's fuzzy. You know what I mean?
Retention pond over there.
Yeah. So we don't really have a problem with newer developers are pretty good with staying away from those landmines. I think it's mostly subdivisions from the 40s, 70s, where it seems that the review and engineering process wasn't as thorough, and it's causing potential problems with taxation not aligning with municipal boundaries very well.
The other point I wanted to address is I found this very helpful to revisit the topic, especially in light of all of the election concerns that have been out there in the public realm over the last year and such. So, but on your final point there, with that in mind, is there any concern that now with the new legislative focus on election practices and such, some valid, some less than valid, is that going to potentially impact anything that we're doing on that front?
Well, I think a lot of the new election concerns don't affect GIS very much. I think GIS cares about where you're registered to vote and what the voting district boundaries are. That's really all I care about. A lot of the process of how the election is conducted doesn't concern those two aspects.
I'd say the scrutiny on the redistricting question is.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so redistricting, okay, yeah, so redistricting. Redistricting is done at the state level, And I have no personal input on how something is redistricted. The county really only has a say in how a precinct is drawn. I don't think anybody has any problem with precincts being potentially gerrymandered because it's not, there's no elections being held at the precinct level. So.
Committee slots, but that's it.
Right. So I could talk a lot about gerrymandering. I think one of the things.
We all will.
So after the 2010 redistricting, there was one. So we talked about this scoring process of how you can score compactness. After the 2010 redistricting, and then there was that I think it was redistricted again in 2018. But between like 2012 and 2018, there was a congressional district 4 or 7, I forget. I think it was congressional district 4. It was between here and Philadelphia. See how this shape ranks 7% on the Postal Popper? We had a congressional district that was a 4% in Pennsylvania. It was bad. It was really bad. There was 2 different sections of that district that were a third of a mile in width that connected hundreds of thousands of people on each side. I think it was either District 4, District 7. I have a map on my wall in my office.
Like some kind of a duck. I mean,
Yeah, it was a very odd shape.
Yeah.
Yes, it's bad. I mean, like I don't need to look at, you don't need to look at the R's and D's to know something's bad. When you can easily score on compactness. I think compactness is a great way, and the new districts that were in 2018 scored much better on compactness than the 2012 districts that we had for congressional.
We may be in for some more controversy on that. I just want to get at the point that there's nothing that's being done that creates concern for you that will make a lot more work for us.
No, I mean, the only thing that happens is, occasionally we'll have something like this, where they'll split, and this only happened once, between North Middleton 3 and North Middleton 1. No other municipality had this weird thing where, a precinct was split between, so North Middleton 3 precinct was split in 2 by Congressional District 13 and 10. So that does happen. It causes some work, but it's that'll add like a day of work. It's only a day of work because I double, triple, quadruple check because I don't want to make any mistakes. I go over to I actually take my laptop, I go over to the Bureau of Elections, we sit down, we look at the shore system, we look at the maps, we go over it, and we just make sure that we're reapportioning everybody into their proper districts.
the problem is more on the election side of things where they're now creating 2 ballots at one precinct, right? So now you have to make sure that you're keeping those things separate.
Yeah.
So that's really.
Yeah, at the polling place, they have to manage, there's a polling place for North Middleton 3, and at that polling place, they have to figure out, are you supposed to be voting in Congressional District 13 or Congressional District 10? And that causes administrative problems for them at the polling place.
And confusion.
Yes.
And lack of trust.
Yes.
And then they have to watch out for the 7 people at North Middleton 1 that vote in Congressional District 3 or 13.
Okay. Thank you. Really good.
It's very good.
Thank you.
Anybody else questions? Okay, thanks.
I want to point out just a couple things. County has really done a great job creating GIS and making a centralized resource for the county, because GIS is used initially for 911, but now we're seeing it used for planning, assessment, elections, vector control. So thanks for the board and previous boards for setting that up. And then you've seen the power of GIS and the data sharing components. And so as we share with state or other counties, I think the benefit just is that much greater for the county. So just.
It is a good point because in many regards, the county GIS is seen as the authoritative source of the data. We're the authoritative source for roads, fire response areas, now precincts from the state. And it's great because we have that, we can develop that local data, but that local data should not be in a vacuum. It really is a piece of the puzzle that forms the rest of Pennsylvania. So it's more important to GIS than it is to really almost any other, really any other department in the county, I dare say, that we work with other counties in the state to develop that fuller picture of the state, to develop that complete map of the state with authoritative sources. And it really is only just in the last couple of years where the Department of State and PEMA are now trying to acquire that information from counties to build that authoritative map for the state. So that's going to continue to develop. It's going to start a couple of years. We're going to talk about parcel map for the state. So it's just going to continue, and GIS is just going to accelerate. County GIS is just going to accelerate because one of the goals for Next Gen 911, and it kind of dovetails into other aspects as well. But Next Gen 911, so we're creating those addresses, we're creating those roads for Cumberland County, and we're putting that data into the 911 computer dispatch system. Next Gen 911, a secondary goal of Next Gen 911 is for when you're standing, you have your cell phone, you might be in a brand new development, or you might be in you could be anywhere. And you're looking at Google Maps, you're looking at Apple Maps, whatever maps you're looking at on your phone. That data should be the exact same data that's in the 911 system, right? That's where the data can be scalable. And right now there's, all of the state people are pointing to issues where, county data is not what it's in Google, or is it not what's Apple. And those are commercial entities that, they can do whatever they want, but it'd be great if they could have the resource of county GIS to use to create their maps. There's no reason why we can't just supply that to them at no cost. I mean, all the data is publicly available through PEMA anyway. PEMA has, it's in PEMA's legislation. This is publicly available data.
Yeah, I don't think you're overstating the role of it at all. It seems like it's increasingly an anchor for so many of our different functions and departments. And we do occasionally get comments, positive comments from municipalities and others that they have this available to them, what a great resource it is. So it's starting to be recognized as well. So, and you guys do a fine job. We get comments on that as well. So appreciate hearing that. Thanks.
Carrie Bethany is online and she would like to speak if that's okay.
Okay.
She wants to
unmute. Oh, she needs unmute. Okay. Go ahead, Bethany. Hello.
Hi. I just wanted to say, since we were talking about elections, that because of the GIS department, our records are so accurate. The confidence that I have in our short database because of what GIS does is, it's significant. It makes such a difference, having that voter locator option to use. And like Justin said, we might even use it daily sometimes. And just that they have that available for us, or always available for questions. We have one of the best voter database setups, I think, in the state for sure, because they come to us and want to talk to our GIS department, the voter registration people and everything at the state, because it's so accurate and so good. So we definitely appreciate having them around.
and Megan over in elections, she uses that website so much that she knows, like she can go in there and she can tell, like that Hamptons Pennsboro problem I showed you about. She knows to go in there and look for that taxation authority, and she can find those little issues. She doesn't need. She checks with me, but she's so sophisticated in using that mapping application now that she can find all the little oddities throughout the county and account for them. So it's a good relationship between the GIS and elections.
Fantastic. Anything additional, Bethany?
No, that's it. It's just, we really appreciate
Okay.
it.
Yeah, great. Thanks for your comments there too.
Thank you.
Anybody else have anything? Okay, I think we're wrapping up then. So thanks again, guys, for your.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll move on to item 4 then, which is other business. Is there anything additional we're bringing?
No, not today.
Okay. So we open the floor for public comment. We have no one on. You got this wonderful presentation. That's interesting. Okay.
It's too bad people missed that because
Yeah.
I would guarantee that we'll get the next election, 40,000 questions about it.
We are streaming now through Zoom, so the content is shared on the YouTube.
Oh,
Which is a new edition as of Monday. So that will be on the videos on YouTube.
That's very good.
Nice.
Okay, if we don't have anything else, I'll entertain a motion for adjournment. Move to adjourn. We stand adjourned. Thanks to everybody for being.
Don't end the meeting.
I have that already.
Thanks, Jessica.